Now's the time for our opening panel, which we're calling Unpacking the Challenges, Stirring the Potential. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Makare Stewart Haruwira. She's a professor in Indigenous, Environmental, and Global Studies at the University of Alberta. Makare is of both Scots and Maori descent and is a registered member of the Witaha Iwi in Aotearoa, New Zealand. A grandmother of 7, Makare has been actively engaged in Indigenous issues and the global world for some decades. She is a professor in Indigenous, Environmental, and Global Studies at the University of Alberta, where she leads the intersections of sustainability collaborative research network on water governance, climate change, and the futures of communities. And she will introduce your panel. Awesome.
Actually, Makare Stewart Harawira is a complete mess. I have long time since I've been so moved, Lewis. And I'm completely forgetting about microphones and things. Kia koe, Lewis. Mihi aroha. Kia kouta katoa, naitarangi. Tēnā kouta, he mihi whānui kia kouta. Wotu tautaka. Tautaka wa tēnei. Tuahine. It's not at all how I meant to begin. But what Lewis just did was encapsulate the entire purpose of this gathering and of this great heart of hers that has brought everybody here to this point, to remind us about this point in time, to remind us of our deep connection to each other. And so, Lewis, again, thank you. And so it is an enormous honour, and privilege to introduce the speakers on this panel. I am really thrilled to be here with these speakers. Jeanette Armstrong, who is so well known and so loved and admired, and yet whom I've never had the privilege of being with before now, which astonishes me. Jeanette, as you well know, is, forgive me for my mispronunciations, Jeanette, a Silek Okanagan, fluent speaker of Cheyenne, traditional knowledge keeper of the Okanagan Nation, founder of Inakwin Revitalization Institute of Higher Learning and her knowledge and language. She currently holds the Canada Research Chair in Okanagan Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy at UBC and Okanagan campus. She has a PhD in Environmental Ethics and Shillelagh Indigenous Literature. She is the recipient of the Eco Trust Buffet Award for Indigenous Leadership. She is an author and an Indigenous activist whose published works include literary titles, academic writing on a wide variety of Indigenous issues. She currently serves on Canada's Traditional 17 Knowledge Subcommittee of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife. And I think there's a couple of words missing off that bio, so my apologies. Sorry about this. Nothing like being sidelined so profoundly. Dr. Lalita Bardwash, Professor, Associate Professor of the School of Public Health at the University of Saskatchewan. She is committed to finding solutions and understanding issues associated with inequitable access supply and provision of safe, sustainable drinking water, supplies for First Nations, rural and remote Saskatchewan communities. Through her community-based participatory research activities, she's provided learning opportunities for university and local students, facilitated regional, national, and international interdisciplinary research collaborations, and has provided opportunities to build research capacity at the local and university level. And finally, Dr. Ian McKinnon, Research Fellow at the Centre of Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University in the UK. Ian is a Gael who belongs to a crofting family. It's been my pleasure to meet some of that family. And to the Gaelic culture, which is indigenous to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. He has chosen to spend time learning from cultural elders, and his approach is rooted in and draws inspiration from the transformative power of Gaelic song, some of which we heard last night, music and indigenous knowledge. His work focuses on the politics of how our land is governed in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. As well as academic publications, he has contributed in a range of media on aspects of the area's history and culture, particularly in relation to land and indigenous knowledge. He is currently working on an analysis of the Highlands and Islands as a site of historical colonization. Actually, he's done that work, he's preparing it for publication, and I can tell you it's tremendous work. Ian believes that understanding the area's longitudinal and underlying imperial power relations and concomitant attitudes may be vital to properly understand and negotiate political contestation in the Highlands and Islands today. I'm enormously delighted to introduce these speakers and very much looking forward to their comments. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, now you can hear me. Okay. I'd like to thank you for welcoming me to your territory and to provide some thoughts and stimulation around discussions around how we can adapt as a nation and as a people to some of the threats we are experiencing on Mother Earth. I would like to begin just saying that ecological integrity and sustainable development are the cornerstones to public health and well-being for all living creatures on the environment. However, there are many threats that are occurring today, and it is causing some concern as to whether or not we as individuals and other living creatures are able to adapt to these changes. The elements within our earth are vital for our well-being. And these include agents such as the air that we breathe, the oxygen content in our atmosphere, the water, the plants, the biodiversity of our animals. Just yesterday, when I was watching the news, the World Wildlife Federation report indicated that 50 to 70% of our ocean's fish are declining, and this is going to continue. What we need to do and what is called for are innovative approaches to deal with the threats that are threatening our livelihoods and the livelihoods of our brothers and sisters, our plants and animals. Now, what I'd like to do is to share with you some innovative approaches that are occurring in the Northwest Territories through the Slave River Watershed Environmental Effects Program. What I'd like to do is to describe how Western scientists and Indigenous people are working together to develop a community-based water monitoring program to understand the impacts of the water supplies in their territory and to learn and to be informed to inform decisions around adaptation to those changes. What I'd like to do next is look at how water is connected to health, the environment, society, and knowledge. And I would like to make some statements around how water is looked at from a historical perspective, and then present some statements how perhaps we could utilize new paradigms and new innovative ways of thinking to address some of the issues around water quality and water quantity to sustain water supplies for our future generations. So if we take water and public health, historically, water problems were uncovered through laboratories by highly trained personnel against a particular set of standards controlled by government agencies. Policy were made on a reactive basis after public health emergencies resulted in death or disease. Actions, including infrastructure development or updates to policy, arose from these events. Site-by-site evidence was gathered by scientists in formalized, westernized scientific ways through hierarchical groups. I'm hoping this works. It's time for a new paradigm. Sorry. I should have told you I was going to do that. I hope I didn't cause any health impacts. On-site preventative testing is done by locally based, trained, interested people. Evidence-based and preventative policy is co-created with local people. Policy is emerging at the local, regional, provincial, watershed, and national levels. More and more people using holistic study approaches included two-eyed seeing. Multi-barrier approaches are being used to prevent public health emergencies and to increase resilience. Water in the environment. Historically, studied in reductionist and mechanical ways by hydrologists, biologists, engineers. Hydrologists studied dynamics of water, biologists studied water and species food chains, engineers studied water infrastructure and environments. Species-based or chemical pathogen-based research, indicators used against standard and expected outcomes. Qualitative and quantitative studies conducted in isolation from each other. It's time for a new paradigm. Study water dynamics at the watershed level. Include functionalities of water and ecosystems in studies. Examine the dynamics of water in an environment as a transdisciplinary team working to solve a problem. Studies people's perception of water over time in locations where there is a long history of observations and management of water in culturally rich ways. This recognizes people as a component of an ecosystem, not just a recipient of ecosystem services. Citizen science accepted as an appropriate way to add knowledge to water and environment systems. Study ice, water quality, water quantity, flow regimes, effects of infrastructure, etc., together instead of in isolation. Water in society. Historically, water management based on have and have-not societies. No long-term planning involved. Band-aid solutions, such as money for infrastructure, but not for long-term maintenance of facilities. Hierarchical and dictatorial policy imposed on people. For example, Bill S-8 focuses on policy of water services, not managing water. Poor recognition of limits of water systems. It's time for a new paradigm. Recognition of the need for interdisciplinary research and community-based participatory research. Develop a suite of solutions to water problems. planning for long-term sharing, water sharing, and in anticipation of uncertainties, working on leveling access across the country and emphasizing the needs of vulnerable people, policy being built with and bought into by people from the ground up, local people having a say, setting limits on our individual and group behaviors with respect to water use and management, instead of using water to its limit. Water and knowledge. Historically, water knowledge in the public health sphere was empirically based, scientifically researched, reductionist, measured chemical elements and pathogens according to standard values. Modeling-based built knowledge through using model stimulations, not practical experience. Quantifiable indicators preferred over other indicators, such as traditional knowledge indicators. Research-driven, basic research questions asked and measured under controlled conditions. Knowledge, not very accessible, sealed and protected. It's time for a new paradigm. Two-eyed seeing and strong like two tractors approach recognizes that researchers need to learn from people on the ground, tacit knowledge, and researchers can also share knowledge with others and share in the knowledge creation process. Knowledge blending is more common, involving lay experts with long experience and tacit knowledge of water in places is desirable. Problem-based research over basic research is preferred. Co-creation and co-disseminate research together. Share in the knowledge created and the responsibility for that knowledge. Thank you. I hope my comments spurs.
Wai khashkal khalt ya yati bis naqsil kan lemt kan skits kala kal mnimslam us kan mnimslam bi skil khwal tlail tem kula kan lemt is skolam pi yat ya yati skil khwal lail tem kula is skolam pni. Just give greetings from my relatives and give acknowledgement and thank you to the leaders and the chiefs and the elders from these communities, this community, this land that we're on, welcomed us here, and all my Salish cousins, because I'm interior Salish and these are Coast Salish people, it's territory as I understand it, that our blood runs deep. Thousands of years ago, we're your people, and we're your people. And I also like to give acknowledgement and thanks to the organizers, to Dr. Lewis and Dr. Nancy Turner and others that have organized this, and the contributors to this, and all the contributors that have come here to share in a really good way with each other about this most important and critical topic. And I want to acknowledge some friends, Richard and Marlene. It's really good to hear that you're going to be here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you. And Barb, Limnamt, Khashkhalkhalt. I want to just spend my time talking through. I'm not going to be reading any of this. I'm just going to be going through these slides, and you can read them for yourself as I'm talking. The idea that I really want to talk about is that idea of indigeneity and the idea of snaksil. Some of you may have read my article in Jerry Mander's an argument for the local and against globalization about about the idea of sharing one's skin, and I want to talk more about that than to talk about some of these kinds of problems that we all know surrounds us, but in a lot of ways find it much too overwhelming from our individual selves to even think about what can we do, how can we respond, how can I be responsible, and how can I find a way to do something to stop this when the whole machinery runs to do this, as Dr. Williams was pointing out to us earlier, and many, many others are pointing out to us. I think one of the ideas of cultural diversity is an expression of what we're doing to the biodiversity. If you, some of you may recall and may want to look this up, the article that I did with Dr. Theodore Rozak in Ecopsychology talks about this idea that the things that are happening in our physical environment are really expressions of what's happening in our own psychology as human beings. And that, as one of my colleagues, Dr. Tirso Gonzalez says, we are out of our indigenous minds. And so that, I think, is really a place where I really think we need to spend some time thinking about that we are out of our indigenous minds, that we all need to be back in our indigenous minds. That indigeneity and indigenousness really are a social paradigm rather than race or ethnicity or a political construct or a framework of the government like Aboriginal rights. Those things are necessary to protect those people that still remain. This is my brother talking to a group of non-Indigenous people about how that idea must work in every local place. I really believe that the idea of reconstructing it with real people, with real projects on the land continuously must be one of the ways that we think about. So this framework of Snaksil principles has to be involved in the way that we interrelate, the way that we learn about the place, and the way that we learn about what that place needs from us. And I know that my granddaughter sitting there, I know that she's often told me, the world changes when we're out there picking berries or digging roots or bringing in the salmon. And she tells me, I don't want to go back to the way people live and the terrible things that our young people are going through. That idea of that illness that Erica Diaz, who was the special rapporteur on Indigenous rights, talked about, she said that illness is not an illness of Indigenous people, it's an illness of everyone else. And so everyone else, what is the antidote for that illness? What is the remedy for that illness? Is to re-indigenize. So bringing back that consciousness, that social paradigm, doesn't mean that you take on the rights and you take over the rights of Indigenous peoples. It means that you find ways to protect and collaborate and become one of the people of that place, and to stand side by side in alliance with them in protecting all of those things. Like this here, this is my grandson. He was 9 years old when he got his first moose. For us, that feeds elders in our community, that feeds women in our community, that feeds us, and that stands him up as a man at 9 years old. And all the community celebrates that. That's a different value in terms of the use of those weapons, in terms of the use of teaching that value. He respects that weapon. He uses that weapon and picks it up only to bring food and to give thanks to that animal that gives us food. And to create these ceremonies, that's what this knowledge is about. That's what these ceremonies and these songs are about. It expresses that relativeness, that relationship that these children here are learning. You cannot theorize about it. You have to actualize it. You have to take the children out there. You have to bring the non-Indigenous people back to it. Right now, today, our people are going to ceremonies in the Okanagan that we're missing to bring the salmon bones back to the river to thank the salmon for giving their lives. That ceremony invites everyone to come to that ceremony and to be brushed off with the river water, to cleanse them and to give back to the water the negative things that cause this world to be the way it is. That kind of reciprocity is internal from us as human beings and physical in terms of what we do. So those internalized laws become a spiritual guiding force from us in terms of our interactions to our children, to our guests, to the people who become part of our land and part of our community. And I think that's really an important aspect. There cannot be this idea of us and them when it comes to this, when it comes to the idea of creating communities that are going to be resilient, that are going to stand fast together, and that will change. Because every time you do this kind of work with non-Indigenous people, every time you go out there, it shifts the paradigm. It changes the way things are done. And it changes the way that we react to these kinds of things in which we make those experiences transformative. We make opportunities available, and then we begin to change that paradigm. That idea of implementing those practices, though that idea of Indigenous-led local land restorations, for example, is really an important one because it includes all of the ceremonies. It includes creating academic institutions for that. And it includes inviting those scientists to stand side by side with people like my brother and myself and others in our community to work together and understand each other, but most of all, to become relatives with each other, to know that this man here, these people here who are knowledge keepers in their land are my relatives, they're my cousins. And committing to that means doing those ceremonies in the way we need to do them and inviting people to feel that inside, to embrace that, to internalize that. So what can happen is this huge project that, for example, the restoration of salmon that take states, Washington State, Canada, the province of British Columbia, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and 7 tribes down the river to work together to bring back salmon to our people when it was not there for over 60 years. And this first salmon run at Okanagan Falls, where they're having the ceremony this weekend, is one of the biggest runs that they've seen in 100 years. So this kind of reciprocity, using it to feed the community, not just our community, but it's distributed to the food banks and distributed to other people in our community, because that salmon doesn't belong to the government. It doesn't belong to the DFO. It belongs to the river and to whom it feeds. So we have to change that paradigm. We have to challenge that paradigm. We have to look at making sure that creating that one skin isn't a division about the restoration of food systems and immersing people in it. This is one example that I want to leave you with, this example of re-indigenizing that historic treaty that was signed last year. Dr. Leroy Littlebear came to do a talk about it at the Anaukin Center, and it is an example of that kind of huge collaboration that brings back the bison, free-ranging bison. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine what will that mean in terms of food and spirituality and ceremonies and people? And it's not just the tribal people that are involved in this. It really needs that collaboration. It really needs those strong alliances to accomplish that. So I wanted to leave you with that kind of wonderful work that is possible, that we can do, and I'm really looking forward to seeing and hearing you in the next day and a half that I will be here. Lim lim twai, hi wai.
Martin Vaguiv, son halapan ich ha an hio betulla gra go tangela hashin ri Seut First Nation son curig fieli a hook shiv gain vi nur duhich aling. Good morning to you all. On behalf of the Scottish delegation that's here, we would like to thank the Seut First Nation for the invitation to spend some time in your beautiful lands. We're very glad to be here. Thank you. We'd also like to thank Lewis and the team for organizing this summit and for inviting us to be part of it. Thank you very much. And thank you for the ceremony this morning, for setting us up for the day in the right way. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm not an elder, and I feel very humbled to be in this company. And I would like to share what I can from our people as best I can here. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of my Auntie Joan Campbell, and my mother, Colleen McLean, here with me today. Well, I suppose I felt my contribution to this session might be to speak indirectly to the issue of re-indigenisation, and perhaps more directly to the question of why people from Scotland should be at a gathering like this at all. Because for many people here, the primary experience of people from Scotland will have been as colonisers rather than as a colonised or indigenous people. And that awareness came to me again very soon after I stepped off the plane in Victoria Airport when we were met by Kathy Nelson, and she was showing us some of the areas that we would be visiting. And I noticed on the map a place called Craigdarragh, where there's a hotel, I think a castle. And our taxi driver this morning was telling us that it had been taken from Scotland brick by brick and rebuilt here. I don't know what was going on there. It seems crazy to me. And we don't want to ask for it back. You can keep it. But crake, I'm presuming that in that area there is a large rock or a crake and an oak tree, which is a darragh in the Gaelic language that name comes from. I also saw that there's several areas called Campbell in the north of the island, and I'm presuming that there was a form of colonisation by Campbells there at some point. And a town called Kildonnan, which is the Gaelic for the Church of Donnan, who was a 7th century Celtic monk and saint in the west of Scotland. And that name really struck me because the name Kildonnan is very evocative in the culture of the Gaels. It's a strath in the very far north of Scotland that is very empty today because the people who lived there were violently removed from their lands around 200 years ago by an English duke, by surveyors and land managers who were from the lowlands of Scotland and not Gaels, and by a duchess who was a Gael, but who'd been colonised in her mind from a very early age, as had her ancestors. And so I think, in telling that story, the people then were moved. They were burned from their homes in many cases, and they were moved to the coast. And those that didn't stay on the coast were shipped off to other parts of the empire, and some of them, it seems, came to Vancouver Island. And I share that story not to try to excuse what's been done in this land, but maybe to give an indication of the kinds of feelings and the trauma that these people were bringing with them when they came here. Because I think we need to understand these stories if we want to break this cycle of violence that we're in. In my research, I've been very been helped by some words from a Maori scholar, a lady called Linda Tahiwai Smith, who said that it's important for Indigenous peoples to revisit sites in their history and to rewrite them and rewrite them. And what she meant by that, I think, is that not only do you rewrite it, but you try to put it right from an Indigenous perspective. And so I've learned many things, one being that a regiment that I think people in Canada will have heard of, it's called the Black Watch. I believe there's a Canadian regiment of the Black Watch. It's a Highland regiment, and it's been involved in most of the British imperial campaigns from the late 1700s onwards, right through to the taking down of the flag in the last British colony in Hong Kong in 1997. And I learned that regiment was formed when the Campbells were colonising the lands of the Macleans in the West Highlands in the early 1700s to put down native resistance. So there was internal colonisation within Scotland, or they were the agents of internal colonisation before they then moved on to become the agents of external colonisation. And I see that same pattern emerging in our history, and I believe it goes right the way as far back as the year 1100, and I think it goes further back to 1066 and what's often called the Norman conquest of England and many other parts of Britain, which tends to elide the fact that it wasn't just a conquest, it was also a really brutal colonization and taking away of land of indigenous peoples there. And I think Jeanette mentioned Eric Irene Deas, the UN rapporteur former rapporteur on indigenous peoples, and she talked about the fact that Europeans have a diseased consciousness, and we've had it for so long we've forgotten what it is, and that history that we tend not to think about in that way is part of that consciousness that we need to work with. And so I think there's another way of thinking about internal colonization, not just the history of it and the politics of it, but what colonization does. And this is not speaking from the head, but maybe more speaking from the heart. What does colonization do to people? What are the cultural and the psychological consequences of that? And a lady, a Sami lady, has helped me to understand this. She says that colonization, or the colonizers, come like thieves. They come like a thief, and they take things from us. They take our songs, they take our music, they take our language, and we're not really aware of what's going on. And gradually, the pain that we're feeling from that, to try to deal with it, we begin to colonize ourselves. We do it to ourselves. And that helped me to understand a lot. In terms of language, I'm talking about language, but really I'm talking about everything that language is an expression of, all the parts of a way of life that are expressed in language. So in a place in the centre of Scotland, it's called Ranach. It's a very empty place now, but in the 1800s there were 5 little schools in Ranach and many communities. And this is how Gaelic was treated in the schools in Ranach in the middle of the 1800s. An old man recalling growing up there in the 1830s said that anyone caught speaking Gaelic, and the person that did this was probably a Gaelic speaker, the teacher that did this, was made to wear a chain around their neck for the rest of the day, from which was suspended a human skull. That was how the language was being treated. And there are many stories of people being belted until they learned to speak English in school. My mother's mother went to school speaking only Gaelic, and she was belted until she learned to speak English by a Gaelic speaker. We do it to ourselves. We colonize ourselves. And so she chose not to pass on the language to my mother because she didn't want her to go through that. And so my mother was not able to pass on the Gaelic language to me. So I'll never be a native speaker of Gaelic. And that also applies to many of the things that go with that. There are many things that have not been passed on to me. And I've had to go back as an adult and try very imperfectly to learn some of these things that weren't passed on. A man called Taiyaki Alfred, who is at the University of Victoria, calls this self-conscious traditionalism. And I think that's a phrase I found very helpful. And another thing I found very helpful is the words of one of our bards, a man called Sorley MacLean, probably, in my view, the greatest Gaelic bard of the 20th century. He wrote a poem called Halig. Halig is a place that his ancestors were cleared from on the island of Raasay. And in that poem, he brings life back to this abandoned village by using the nature that's there, the animals, the plants, the trees, and he makes them the people that he remembers that he was told about who lived there. And he begins the poem, Hachim am fiag na cullia Halig. Time, the deer, is in the wood of Halig. And in Gaelic cosmology, the deer are fairy cattle. They're the other word cattle. They're the source of inspiration, of creativity. And so he's invoking that and bringing life back to the village. And at the end of the poem, he says that the deer that is going sniffing around in the wood will be hit by a vehement bullet from the gun of love, and its eye will freeze in the wood. And then the last line of the poem is, its blood will not be traced while I live. That was his statement. And it helped me to understand that all those decisions that the parents and the grandparents and the ancestors have made to deny us or to take away from us the opportunity to learn that which is indigenous to us were acts of love. They were still strong in their hearts. They thought they were protecting us from what they'd faced. And so the words that John Mohawk, whose words are being used to help frame this event, said that colonization is the means by which we are systematically confused. We're confused in our heads, but our hearts are still strong. And those words of Solly MacLean mean, I think, it gives us two things, or it gives me two things. One is it gives me a place from which to critically engage with the forces that have colonized us. And secondly, it helps me to understand that there's a whole world, a cosmology from my people that I can use to understand who I am and what I'm coming from and where I'm coming from. And that's both in terms, I think, of reconstituting us as a people, but also I think that the kinds of insights that Jeanette's been sharing and that we're going to hear throughout this event have a much broader inspirational potential. And I'm looking forward to us beginning to harness that in the days that come and in our work in the future. Mi levianach aropa snalai and shaw snalmri chach. Thank you.
Well, there was three extremely rich and powerful presentations that contain so much that I cannot possibly begin to capture. But I just do want to say, yes, indeed, there is a need for a new paradigm. And what we're hearing is the beginnings of the struggle over the emergence of that new paradigm, and how do we bring this new paradigm collaboratively, thoughtfully, in deep connection together. And Jeanette's beautiful work on the need to re-indigenize, and what does that mean? And she talked about the fracturing, and the way in which the fracturing of the environment is a reflection of the fracturing of ourselves. And also the fracturing of our own indigenous minds. That phrase will resonate forever in my mind. We are out of our indigenous minds. And it reminds me of the cell. The need for a healthy cell depends on the state of the health of the relationship between the cell and its environment, and the deep rift that has occurred between ourselves and our environment, and the way in which we became out of our indigenous minds. And Ian, reminding us of the history of violence and trauma that has gone with every act of colonization, and that we tend to think of colonization occurring in specific ways in specific areas to specific people, and we have particular ideas of who and what that is. And Ian reminding us of the history of his people and of the Gaels as Indigenous people, and it's such powerful work, and profoundly the fact that the colonization of ourselves and that process and the way we come to colonize our own selves, reminding me of our own ancestors at home, and that homily, that exhortation to learn the ways of the Pākehā. And I'm listening to many of our old people that have long gone in my head, was actually an act of love. Thank you for that, Ian. And often what we do is we talk about that in terms of hegemony, that we've become captured by colonization and that we've become, what's that word? I'm an academic, I'm supposed to not forget these words. Anyway, homogenized, I guess, or something. But actually, it was an act of love to protect us. And out of that act of love has come this situation. And now, out of another act of love, we have to recover our Indigenous minds. Hugely powerful presentations. I'm not sure that there is time for questions because of the framework for this morning, but I think this leads so beautifully into the keynote speaker that is going to follow this. And so again, I want to just very much thank the three panelists for their extremely powerful and moving words, and for again repositioning our own minds as we come into the next session. So thank you.